I walked out of my in-laws' Christmas dinner at 9:47 p.m. on December 23rd, and by the time I reached my car, I'd already decided my marriage was over. Not because of what my wife Patricia said to me in the hallway 5 minutes earlier, and not even because of how she humiliated me in front of her entire family at the dinner table. I decided it was over because I finally understood something I'd been too stupid to see for 3 years. She didn't just disrespect me, she hated me. Let me back up. Patricia and I met 6 years ago when I was working as a project manager at a consulting firm. Decent money, good benefits, the kind of job her parents approved of. We got married 4 years ago, and for the first year, everything was fine. Then I made the mistake of telling her about this idea I'd been working on with two of my college friends, David and Lucas. We wanted to build a platform that would help small businesses automate their client management systems. Nothing revolutionary, but there was a real gap in the market and we had the technical skills to fill it. Patricia told me it was a terrible idea. She said I was throwing away a stable career for a fantasy, that startups fail 90% of the time, that I was being selfish and irresponsible. Her dad, Warren Sr., had worked for the same company for 35 years before retiring with a pension. Her mom, Julie, had been a teacher for 27 years. They believed in stability and playing it safe and doing things the right way. My startup didn't fit their worldview. But here's what Patricia never understood, or maybe she did understand and just didn't care. I wasn't some reckless dreamer throwing money at a pipe dream. I kept my job for the first year while we built the prototype. I didn't touch our savings. I worked nights and weekends, sacrificed sleep and social time, but I made sure our bills were paid and our life stayed stable. When we finally had enough traction to justify me going full-time, I had 6 months of salary saved up and we'd already signed our first 3 clients. I quit my job 2 years ago. Patricia acted like I'd committed a crime. She stopped mentioning what I did for work when people asked. She'd change the subject or make vague comments about me being between opportunities. At family gatherings, she'd steer conversations away from careers whenever possible. When that didn't work, she'd give me these looks, these warning glances that said, "Shut up, don't embarrass me, just sit there and smile." The startup had its struggles. Of course it did. We lost a major client last spring, which set us back financially. We had to pivot our business model in September, which meant 3 months of uncertainty. But we also had wins. We landed a contract with a regional chain that brought in more revenue than our first year combined. We hired our first employee in October. We were growing, slowly but steadily, and I believed in what we were building. Patricia saw none of that. She only saw that I wasn't bringing home the same paycheck I used to make. She only saw that her friends' husbands had titles like senior director and vice president, while I was a co-founder of a company nobody had heard of. She started making comments. Little digs at first, jokes about me playing businessman, suggestions that maybe I should look for real work. Then the comments got sharper. She started calling it my hobby, my little project. She told her sister Kylie that I was having a midlife crisis at 32. I should have confronted her sooner. I should have sat her down and made her understand that this wasn't just about money or status, that I was building something meaningful, that I needed her support or at least her respect. But I kept thinking things would get better. I kept thinking that once the business stabilized, once we had steady income, once I could prove it wasn't just a fantasy, she'd come around. I was wrong. Christmas at her parents' house was always a production. Her mom, Julie, spent weeks planning the menu, decorating the house, making sure everything was perfect. Her brother Warren and his wife brought their 2 kids. Her sister Kylie came with her husband. There were cousins, aunts, uncles, probably 20 people total. I usually just kept my head down at these things, helped with dishes, played with the kids, tried not to give Patricia any reason to be annoyed with me. This year felt different from the moment we arrived. Patricia had been cold to me all week, barely speaking, sleeping on the far edge of the bed. I figured she was stressed about the holidays, about money, about all the usual stuff. I didn't realize she'd been building up to something. We'd been there maybe an hour when Patricia grabbed my arm in the hallway outside the kitchen. Her fingers dug into my bicep hard enough that I knew there'd be marks later. She leaned in close and told me to keep my mouth shut about my joke of a career. "Everyone here thinks you're a loser," she said. "Just smile and try not to humiliate me." I pulled my arm away. I asked her what the hell that was about, why she was talking to me like that. She just stared at me with this look I'd never seen before, this mixture of contempt and disgust, and walked back toward the dining room. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds trying to process what had just happened. Then I followed her back because what else was I going to do? Leave before dinner? Dinner started fine. The usual small talk, people passing dishes, compliments about the food. Then Warren asked the table about everyone's promotions and year-end bonuses. He just made partner at his law firm and wanted to talk about it, which was fair. It was a big accomplishment. A few other people chimed in with their work updates. I sat there cutting my ham, staying quiet like Patricia wanted. Then Patricia cut in. "Michael," she said, loud enough that everyone stopped talking. "He's still playing pretend at his little startup. Honestly, it's embarrassing just being seen with him." The table went quiet. I looked up and she was staring at me with this smirk, this challenge in her eyes. Her cousin Lisa laughed nervously. Someone changed the subject. I put down my fork and excused myself to the bathroom. I stood in there for 5 minutes, staring at myself in the mirror, trying to figure out what was happening, why my wife would say something like that in front of her entire family. When I came back, people were starting dessert. I sat down and tried to act normal. Then Julie suggested that Patricia make a toast since she'd been talking about wanting to say something special this year. Patricia stood up with her wine glass and launched into this speech about family and values and choosing the right partner in life. Then she turned and looked directly at me. "I guess some of us just have to carry the dead weight in our marriages," she said. Her cousins laughed. Warren looked uncomfortable. Kylie was staring at her plate. I slowly put down my glass. I looked Patricia in the eyes and told her she just killed us. Then I stood up, grabbed my coat from the front closet, and walked out into the snow. I sat in my car in their driveway for a while. Engine running, heat blasting. Patricia didn't come after me. Nobody did. I drove to a hotel and checked in for the night. I turned off my phone because I didn't want to see whatever messages she might send, whatever excuses or explanations or fake apologies. I turned my phone back on the next morning. There were 7 texts from Patricia, all variations of "where are you and you're overreacting and we need to talk." Nothing about what she'd said. Nothing that resembled an actual apology. I didn't respond. I spent Christmas Day in that hotel room thinking about everything that had led to this moment. Every comment she'd made about my work, every time she'd cut me off when I tried to talk about the business, every look of disappointment when I told her we couldn't afford something she wanted. I'd been so focused on making the startup work that I'd missed what was right in front of me. My wife didn't believe in me, didn't respect me, and didn't want to be married to me anymore. But here's what she didn't know. The business was actually doing better than I'd let on. That client we'd lost in the spring, we'd replaced them with 2 bigger ones. That pivot in September, it had opened up a whole new market for us. We'd closed out the year with revenue that would have shocked her if she'd ever bothered to ask. And I'd been keeping detailed records of everything. Every financial contribution I'd made to our household, every asset we'd acquired during the marriage, every expense I'd covered while building the company. I wasn't just angry, I was done. And I was ready. Update 1. I stayed at that hotel through December 26th. Patricia called me 17 times that day. I didn't answer any of them. She texted me that we needed to talk like adults, that I was being childish, that this was ridiculous. Still nothing about what she'd actually said at dinner. No acknowledgement that she'd publicly humiliated me in front of her entire family. Just annoyance that I'd left and wasn't coming home. On December 27th, I drove back to our apartment. We'd been renting a 2-bedroom place in a decent neighborhood for the past 3 years. Lease was in both our names. Rent was split from our joint account, though I'd been covering about 70% of it since I started the company. Patricia's car was gone when I got there, which I'd timed deliberately. She worked as an administrative coordinator at a marketing agency, regular 9-to-5 schedule, so I knew I had the place to myself. I went through our home office, found her laptop sitting on the desk, not even password protected because she'd always trusted me completely. I wasn't looking for anything specific at first. I just wanted to understand what had been going through her head, why she'd turned so vicious. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. There were Instagram DMs going back 18 months, conversations with her sister Kylie, her cousin Lisa, her college friend Monica. All of them talking about me, about my pathetic little business that was going nowhere, about how embarrassing it was for Patricia to be married to someone who'd given up a real career, about how she should have seen the red flags before we got married. In one message from October, Patricia told Kylie that she'd made a huge mistake marrying me and didn't know how to fix it without looking like a failure herself. But the one that really got me was from 3 weeks before Christmas. Lisa asked Patricia what she was going to do about me long-term. Patricia wrote back that she was done pretending to support my midlife crisis, that she'd been talking to Warren about what a divorce would look like financially, and that she wanted to make sure I couldn't take anything from her when this finally ended. When this finally ended. Like our marriage was already over in her mind and she was just waiting for the right moment to pull the trigger. Like I was some burden she needed to strategically offload. I took photos of everything with my phone, every conversation, every disparaging comment, every admission that she'd been planning for this. Then I closed the laptop and sat there in our office chair thinking about how I'd spent 3 years trying to build something while my wife had spent those same 3 years plotting her exit strategy. Patricia came home around 6:30. I was sitting on the couch when she walked in. She stopped when she saw me, put down her bag, and asked where I'd been. I told her I'd been at a hotel thinking about our marriage. She sat down on the other end of the couch and launched into this whole speech about how what happened at Christmas was a misunderstanding, how I'd overreacted, how she'd been stressed and drank too much and said things she didn't mean. I asked her which part she didn't mean, the part where she called my career a joke, or the part where she said I was dead weight. She got defensive immediately. She said I was twisting her words, that it had been a lighthearted comment, that her family knew she was just joking around. I asked her if that's what she told them afterwards, that it was just a joke. She said, of course, what else was she supposed to say? Then I asked her about the Instagram messages. Her face changed. She asked me what messages. I pulled out my phone and started reading them to her. The one about my pathetic business. The one about regretting marrying me. The one about talking to Warren about divorce finances. She sat there getting paler with each message, and when I finished, she told me I had no right to go through her private conversations. I just stared at her. I said, that's your response? Not an apology, not an explanation, but anger that I found out what you really think of me? She said I'd violated her privacy, that those messages were taken out of context, that she was venting to her friends, and everyone does that. I asked her what context would make it acceptable to tell your sister that you made a huge mistake marrying me. She didn't have an answer for that. We argued for 2 hours. Patricia kept trying to reframe everything. She said she'd been supportive of the startup at first, but I'd promised it would only be temporary, that I'd go back to real work once we got it off the ground. I told her I never promised that I'd always been clear this was what I wanted to build long-term. She said I was remembering it wrong, that I'd changed the plan without consulting her, that she'd signed up to be married to someone with a stable career, not someone playing entrepreneur. I asked her why she didn't just leave me if she was so unhappy. She said she'd been trying to make it work, trying to be patient, hoping I'd come to my senses. Then she said something that made everything click into place. She said her parents had sacrificed their whole lives to give her and her siblings stability and security, that she'd grown up watching her dad work the same job for decades, so the family would always be taken care of, and that I was throwing away that same security for a fantasy that would probably fail anyway. That's when I understood. It wasn't really about the money or the status. It was about her family's values, about what her parents had drilled into her, about how a good husband provides stability, about how taking risks was selfish and irresponsible. I'd violated some fundamental rule she'd been raised with, and she couldn't forgive me for it. In her mind, I'd failed as a husband the moment I left my corporate job, and nothing I could do would ever change that. I told her I wanted a divorce. She laughed, actually laughed and said I couldn't afford a divorce, that my little business barely made enough to cover my half of the bills. I told her she had no idea what the business made because she'd never bothered to ask. She said she didn't need to ask. She could see our bank account. She knew I was barely scraping by. I asked her if she'd checked the business account lately. She got quiet. The truth was, I'd been keeping most of the business revenue in the company account. We had operating expenses, payroll now that we'd hired someone, equipment costs, the usual overhead. But we were profitable, and that profit had been accumulating. Patricia had never asked about it because she'd assumed the business was failing. She'd been so convinced I was wasting my time that she never considered the possibility that I was actually succeeding. She started backtracking then. She said we didn't need to talk about divorce, that we could work through this, that maybe she'd been too harsh. I told her it was too late for that. She'd shown me exactly what she thought of me, exactly how little respect she had for what I was building, and I wasn't interested in staying married to someone who saw me as an embarrassment. Then she got angry, really angry. She said I was being dramatic, that I was throwing away our marriage over a few comments, that I was the one who'd ruined Christmas by walking out like a child. I said I walked out because my wife called me dead weight in front of her entire family. She said I was never going to let that go, was I? Like it was unreasonable for me to be upset about being publicly humiliated. I left the apartment again that night, went back to the hotel. Patricia sent me a long text around midnight saying we needed to figure out the living situation, that she couldn't afford the apartment by herself, that I couldn't just abandon our lease. I didn't respond. The next day, Warren called me, her brother, the newly minted law partner. He said Patricia had called him upset, that she'd told him we were having problems and that he wanted to talk to me man to man. I almost didn't answer, but I figured I might as well hear what her family had to say. Warren told me that Patricia loved me and was worried about me. He said the holidays were stressful for everyone, and sometimes people said things they didn't mean. He said walking out on Christmas was a pretty extreme reaction, and maybe I needed to think about whether I was throwing away a good marriage over wounded pride. I asked him if Patricia had told him what she actually said at dinner. He said she'd mentioned there was a misunderstanding about work stuff. I told him there was no misunderstanding, that his sister had deliberately humiliated me in front of everyone, and that if he wanted to help, he should tell her to hire her own lawyer because I was done. He got defensive then. He said I was being unreasonable, that marriage required forgiveness and compromise, that Patricia had put up with a lot over the past 2 years while I figured out my career situation. I asked him what exactly she'd put up with. He said she'd been supportive while I took risks with our financial security, that she'd never complained about the reduced income, that she'd stood by me even though my decisions had been selfish. I realized Patricia had been feeding her family a completely different narrative, one where she was the patient, supportive wife and I was the reckless husband gambling with our future. I told Warren that his sister had been planning to divorce me for months, that she'd literally told people she regretted marrying me, and that whatever sob story she'd told him was complete fiction. He said that wasn't true, that Patricia was devastated and wanted to fix things. I said she could start by being honest with her family about what she'd really said and done. Then I hung up. Patricia called me an hour later. She said Warren told her what I'd said, and I'd completely misrepresented everything. She said those Instagram messages were private venting and didn't reflect how she really felt. I asked her how she really felt then. She said she felt frustrated and scared about our financial future, but that didn't mean she wanted a divorce. I asked her if she'd told Warren she'd been researching divorce finances. She said she'd only been preparing for the worst-case scenario, that it didn't mean she wanted it to happen. We argued again. She kept trying to minimize everything. The Instagram messages were just venting. The Christmas dinner comments were jokes that landed wrong. The conversations with Warren about divorce were just contingency planning. Every terrible thing she'd said or done had some excuse attached to it, some explanation that made it less than what it actually was. I told her I didn't believe her anymore. She said I was being paranoid and vindictive. Then she said something that made me realize how little she understood about what was actually happening. She said that if I really wanted a divorce, we'd need to split everything 50-50, including whatever money the business had made. She said she'd been supporting me emotionally for 2 years while I built that company, so she was entitled to half of whatever it was worth. I asked her how she figured she'd supported me emotionally when she'd spent those same 2 years telling people I was an embarrassment. She said that wasn't the point. The point was that we were married, and anything I'd earned during the marriage was community property. I told her we'd see what a lawyer said about that. She said fine. We'd both get lawyers and figure it out properly. Then she said she was moving back into the apartment and I couldn't stop her, that her name was on the lease too, and she had every right to be there. I told her to do whatever she wanted. Then I hung up and called a divorce attorney. The attorney I found, a woman named Sarah Chen, had been recommended by Lucas's brother who'd gone through a divorce 2 years earlier. She had a consultation slot available the next morning, December 29th. I drove to her office in a professional building downtown and laid out the whole situation. The Christmas dinner, the Instagram messages, the conversations about divorce planning, the fact that Patricia had no idea how much money the business was actually making. Sarah listened to everything, took notes, and asked me questions about our finances. Did we have joint accounts? Yes. Who paid for what? I showed her my records of every payment I'd made toward rent, utilities, groceries, everything over the past 3 years. What assets did we have? The furniture in our apartment was mostly stuff we'd bought together. Both our cars were paid off and titled separately. No kids, no house. This should be relatively straightforward. Then Sarah asked me what I wanted to accomplish. I told her I wanted out of the marriage with my business intact and I wanted Patricia to understand that publicly humiliating me had consequences. Sarah said the first part was doable, but the second part wasn't how divorce law worked. She said the best thing I could do was secure my assets, document everything, and get through this as quickly and cleanly as possible. I asked her about the business. She said that was going to be the complicated part. Anything earned during the marriage was generally community property, which meant Patricia could claim she was entitled to half the business's value. But if I could show that the business's growth was entirely due to my efforts, and that Patricia had not only failed to support it, but had actively undermined me, we might be able to argue for a different split. I told her about the Instagram messages where Patricia had called the business a joke and said she regretted marrying me. Sarah said that would definitely help. We scheduled another meeting for after New Year's to start the formal paperwork. I left her office feeling like I'd taken the first real step toward ending this. Patricia texted me 3 times while I was driving home, asking where I was and when we were going to talk about our living situation. I didn't respond. That night, my business partner David called me. He'd heard from his wife that Patricia had been calling around to mutual friends, saying I'd abandoned her over the holidays and was refusing to communicate. She was building her own narrative, making herself the victim, trying to get people on her side before the divorce became public. David asked me what really happened. I told him the whole story. He said he'd always thought Patricia looked down on what we were doing, that he'd noticed the way she changed the subject whenever someone asked about the business at social events. Then he asked me something that hadn't occurred to me. He asked if I'd protected the business legally. I told him we'd set it up as an LLC with the three co-founders as equal partners. He said, good. That meant Patricia couldn't claim ownership of my partnership stake even if she tried to argue for its value in the divorce. But he also said I needed to make sure she couldn't cause problems for the company itself, couldn't call clients or spread rumors that might damage our reputation. I told him I'd talk to Sarah about that at our next meeting. I spent New Year's Eve in my hotel room working on a detailed financial timeline of our marriage. Every contribution I'd made, every expense I'd covered, every sacrifice I'd made while Patricia had collected her steady paycheck and complained that I wasn't providing enough stability. By the time I finished, I had 40 pages of documentation showing exactly how much I'd put into our household while building the business she'd been mocking to her friends. Patricia sent me a text at 11:58 p.m. on New Year's Eve. She said we'd wasted 3 years together if this was how it was going to end. I looked at that message and thought about how she'd wasted my 3 years by pretending to be supportive while actually resenting everything I was working toward. Then I turned off my phone and went to sleep. The real battle was about to begin. Update 2. I met with Sarah again on January 3rd. She'd drawn up the initial divorce petition, and we went through it line by line. Standard dissolution of marriage, irreconcilable differences, request for equitable distribution of assets. Nothing dramatic, just the legal framework for ending a marriage. She asked me if I wanted to include anything about Patricia's behavior at Christmas or the Instagram messages. I told her to save that for later if we needed it. The petition got filed on January 6th. Patricia was served at her office that afternoon by a process server. She called me 16 times in the next hour. I finally answered on the 17th call. She was crying. She said she couldn't believe I'd actually filed, that she thought we were still working things out, that I'd blindsided her. I reminded her that I'd told her I wanted a divorce 2 weeks ago. She said she thought I was just upset and needed time to cool off. I asked her what part of hiring a divorce attorney made her think I was just cooling off. She said I hadn't told her I'd hired an attorney. I said I didn't need to tell her, that we weren't a team anymore. Then she got angry through the tears. She said I couldn't just file for divorce without discussing it with her first, that this affected both of us and I was being selfish. I told her she'd discussed divorce with her brother months ago without telling me, so I figured I was just following her lead. She said that was different, she was just exploring options. I said filing the petition was me exploring my options too. She wanted to meet in person to talk about it. I said no. She said we couldn't do this over the phone, that we owed each other a face-to-face conversation. I told her we didn't owe each other anything anymore. She said she'd go to the apartment and wait for me there, that I couldn't avoid her forever. I told her I'd already moved my essential stuff out while she was at work, that she could have the apartment for now, and we'd figure out the lease later. That was true. I'd gone back to the apartment on January 4th while Patricia was at her job and packed up everything that mattered: clothes, laptop, important documents, some personal items. I'd left the furniture because I didn't care about it and Patricia would need somewhere to sit. I'd taken photos of everything in the apartment before I left so there'd be a record of what was there. Then I'd found a month-to-month rental, a studio apartment about 20 minutes from our office space, and moved my stuff there. Patricia sent me a long text that night saying I was trying to destroy her life, that serving her at work was humiliating, that her coworkers had seen the process server, and now everyone at her office knew we were getting divorced. I didn't respond. The next day, her mother Julie called me. I almost didn't answer, but I figured I might as well hear what the family had to say now that things were official. Julie told me she was disappointed in me. She said Patricia had called her in tears, that I was handling this divorce in the cruelest way possible, that I was deliberately trying to hurt her daughter. I asked Julie if Patricia had told her what she'd said at Christmas dinner. Julie said Patricia had explained that there had been a misunderstanding, that she'd made some comments that came out wrong. I asked her if that's really what Patricia said, that it came out wrong, not that it was wrong to say. Julie said I was splitting hairs. Then Julie launched into this speech about how marriage was hard work and required commitment through difficult times. She said her husband, Warren Sr., had worked jobs he hated to provide for their family, that she'd sacrificed her own career ambitions to make sure the kids were taken care of. That's what commitment looked like. She said I'd made a commitment to Patricia, and I was throwing it away the first time things got tough. I asked her if she'd stay married to someone who publicly called her dead weight and told their family she was embarrassing to be seen with. Julie said that's not what happened, and I was exaggerating, I told Julie that Patricia had been researching divorce finances and planning her exit strategy for months before Christmas, that I hadn't ended this marriage. I'd just been the first one to file the paperwork. Julie said that wasn't true, that Patricia loved me and wanted to work things out. I asked her why Patricia had told her sister Kylie that she regretted marrying me. Julie got quiet. Then she said that even if Patricia had expressed doubts, that was normal in a marriage. Everyone had doubts sometimes. She said I was taking private venting between sisters and using it as an excuse to abandon my wife. I told her those private vents revealed what Patricia really thought of me, and I wasn't interested in being married to someone who saw me as a mistake. Julie said I was being stubborn and prideful, and someday I'd regret throwing away a good woman over hurt feelings. I hung up on her. Sarah called me later that week with news. Patricia had hired an attorney, someone named Robert Mendez, who apparently had a reputation for being aggressive in divorce cases. Sarah said we should expect Patricia to fight for a significant portion of the business's value. I told Sarah to prepare for that I had detailed financial records showing my contributions versus Patricia's throughout the marriage. Then Sarah asked me something that changed the trajectory of everything. She asked if the apartment lease was in both our names. I said yes. She asked who'd been paying what percentage of the rent. I said I'd been covering about 70% for the past 2 years. She said we should use that. She said if I could show I'd been the primary financial contributor to our housing, we could argue that I should be released from the lease obligation without penalty, since Patricia's behavior had made cohabitation impossible. But then she said something else. She said if I really wanted to put pressure on Patricia financially, I should stop paying my portion of the rent and let Patricia figure out how to cover the full amount herself. The lease was joint and several liability, which meant the landlord could come after either of us for the full rent. But if Patricia couldn't pay, it would be her credit that took the hit, not mine, since I could prove I'd been paying my share. It was a risk, but it would force Patricia to either drain her savings or break the lease and take the financial consequences. I thought about that. Patricia made decent money, probably $55,000 a year, but she'd never been good with savings. She liked eating out, buying clothes, taking weekend trips with her friends. Our apartment was $1,800 a month. She'd been paying about $500 of that recently, which she could afford. But $1,200? That would eat up most of her discretionary income. She'd have to cut back on everything or find a roommate or move somewhere cheaper. I told Sarah to draw up the paperwork to remove me from the lease obligation. She said it would take time and the landlord might not agree to it, but we could try. In the meantime, I stopped making my automatic rent payment from the joint account. I told Sarah to document that I'd paid my share faithfully for 3 years, and that the stoppage was due to Patricia's behavior, making the living situation untenable. Patricia noticed 2 weeks later when the rent was due, and the full amount wasn't there. She texted me asking why I hadn't paid my half. I told her I'd moved out and wasn't paying for an apartment I wasn't living in. She said that wasn't how leases worked, that I was still obligated. I told her to talk to her attorney about it. She said I was trying to bankrupt her. I said she should have thought about that before spending 18 months telling her friends and family that I was an embarrassment. Then Patricia did something I should have seen coming. She started calling our mutual friends with her version of events. She told them I'd abandoned her financially, that I'd filed for divorce without warning, that I was trying to leave her homeless. She told them about the startup, about how I'd prioritized my business over our marriage, about how she'd been patient and supportive, but I'd chosen my company over her. Some of them called me to ask what was really happening. I told them the truth about Christmas dinner, about the Instagram messages, about the divorce planning. Most of them were shocked. A few of them said they'd noticed Patricia seemed unhappy but hadn't realized it was that bad. One couple, Mark and Jennifer, who we'd known since college, told me they'd always thought Patricia was too critical of what I was doing, that they'd been impressed by the business and didn't understand why Patricia wasn't more supportive. But some of them believed Patricia's story. They thought I was being vindictive, that divorce was messy and everyone said mean things when they were upset, that I should be more forgiving. I stopped talking to most of these people. I didn't have the energy to defend myself to people who'd already decided I was the villain. Warren called me again in late January. He said Patricia had told him about the rent situation and he wanted to know what my plan was. I asked him what business it was of his. He said Patricia was his sister and he wasn't going to let me destroy her financially just because my ego was bruised. I told him his sister had spent months planning a divorce behind my back and I was just finishing what she started. He said that didn't give me the right to leave her in a financial crisis. I asked him if he'd offered to help her with rent. He got quiet. Then Warren said something that made me realize how deep Patricia's manipulation went. He said their parents had offered to help Patricia with living expenses until she got back on her feet, but that Patricia had told them she didn't want to accept money. because it would prove I was right about her being dependent. He said she was trying to protect her pride, and I was making it impossible for her to survive independently. I told Warren that if Patricia had saved money instead of spending it on brunches and shopping trips, she wouldn't be in this situation. He said I was being cruel. I asked Warren if he knew that Patricia had told multiple people she regretted marrying me. He said Patricia had been venting in confidence to family members, and I'd violated her privacy by reading those messages. I asked him if he'd be okay with his wife telling her family she regretted marrying him. He said that wasn't the point. I said that was exactly the point, that Patricia's private feelings were what revealed her true character, and her true character was someone who'd been planning to leave me while pretending everything was fine. Warren told me I needed to grow up and accept that marriage was complicated. I told him I was done taking advice from people who saw treating your spouse with contempt as a normal complication. Then I hung up. February brought new problems. Patricia's attorney filed a motion arguing that the business David, Lucas, and I had built was a marital asset and that Patricia was entitled to a portion of its value. The motion claimed that Patricia had supported me emotionally and financially during the startup phase, that she'd sacrificed her own career advancement to accommodate my schedule, and that she deserved compensation for her contributions. Sarah called me when she got the motion. She said it was aggressive, but expected. She asked me if any of the claims were true. Had Patricia sacrificed her career? I told her no. Patricia had worked the same administrative job since before we got married, that she'd never expressed interest in advancing or changing careers. Had she supported me financially? I told her no, that I'd covered more of our expenses than she had even while building the business. Had she supported me emotionally? I told her to read the Instagram messages again. Sarah said we'd file a response showing my financial contributions and Patricia's actual behavior. But she also said we needed to be strategic about this. She said if we push too hard on showing Patricia's lack of support, it might make me look vindictive. If we didn't push hard enough, Patricia might actually get a claim to the business value. We needed to find the middle ground where the evidence spoke for itself. I spent 2 weeks working with Sarah to compile everything. Bank statements showing my higher contributions to household expenses. Text messages where Patricia had complained about the business. Social media posts where she'd deliberately avoided mentioning what I did for work. The Instagram DMs where she'd called it embarrassing and pathetic. Statements from David and Lucas about how Patricia had never shown interest in the business or attended any company events. A timeline showing how the business's growth had coincided with Patricia's increasing hostility. We filed our response on February 12th. Sarah said it was one of the most thorough rebuttals she'd filed in a divorce case. She said if the judge actually read everything, there was no way Patricia would get anything from the business. But she also said judges were unpredictable, that sometimes they split things evenly just to avoid further litigation, that we shouldn't count on logic prevailing. Patricia's attorney filed another motion 3 days later. This one argued that I had been hiding income from Patricia, that the business was more profitable than I'd disclosed, and that I deliberately misled her about our financial situation to gain advantage in the divorce. The motion requested full financial discovery, including business bank statements, tax returns, and accounting records. Sarah said this was fishing, that they were hoping to find something they could use against me. She said we'd comply with discovery but make sure everything was documented properly. She also said this meant Patricia's attorney was getting desperate, that they knew the emotional support argument wasn't going to work, so they were trying to find financial ammunition instead. I met with my accountant to make sure everything was in order. The business had made about $240,000 in revenue last year. After expenses, payroll, and taxes, the three of us had split about $90,000 in profit. My share was $30,000, which was more than Patricia knew about, but nowhere near enough to change the divorce outcome significantly. The accountant confirmed everything was documented correctly, and I hadn't done anything wrong by keeping business finances separate from household finances. Patricia got the financial disclosure documents on February 18th. Her attorney scheduled a call with Sarah within hours. Apparently, Patricia had assumed the business was barely breaking even. Finding out we'd made nearly $250,000 in revenue and that I'd been sitting on $30,000 in business profit had changed her entire approach. Sarah called me after talking to Patricia's attorney. She said they were now demanding a settlement that included half of my business profit from the past year plus half the projected future value of my ownership stake. The number they threw out was around $80,000. Sarah said it was ridiculous, that there was no legal basis for that amount, but that it showed how Patricia's strategy had shifted from portraying me as a failed entrepreneur to portraying me as someone who'd been hiding money. I told Sarah I wasn't giving Patricia anything beyond what the law required for equitable distribution. Sarah said that was my right, but that it would make the divorce more expensive and drawn out. I said I didn't care. I'd spent 3 years building something while Patricia mocked it, and I wasn't going to reward her hostility with a payout. Then I asked Sarah about the documents I'd been preparing. The real pressure. She asked me if I was sure I wanted to go through with it. I told her I'd never been more sure of anything. On February 22nd, Patricia was served with a second set of documents at her sister Kylie's house where she'd been staying for dinner. The process server found her in the driveway getting out of her car. According to the server's report, Patricia opened the envelope right there, read the first page, and ran inside. Kylie called me 20 minutes later screaming that I was a monster, that Patricia had thrown up on her kitchen floor, that whatever I'd done had broken her sister. I didn't respond to Kylie. I turned off my phone and waited. The documents were a detailed accounting of every financial contribution I'd made to our household over 3 years, every expense I'd covered, every payment I'd made, totaling over $68,000 more than Patricia had contributed. The documents included a formal demand for repayment of the excess contribution as a condition of the divorce settlement, along with a proposal that Patricia would assume full responsibility for the apartment lease and any associated penalties for early termination. But that wasn't what made her sick. The second part of the documents outlined my intention to pursue full transparency in the divorce proceedings, meaning I would be depositing copies of all her Instagram messages, texts, and social media posts with the court as evidence of her premeditated planning and emotional abandonment. Every message where she'd called me an embarrassment, every conversation where she'd told her family and friends she regretted marrying me, every admission that she'd been researching divorce while pretending our marriage was fine, all of it would become part of the public court record, accessible to anyone who wanted to look. Sarah had warned me that this was aggressive, that it might make me look vengeful. I told her Patricia had made me look like a failure and an embarrassment for 3 years. Now everyone who'd heard her version would get to see the truth. Patricia started calling me from blocked numbers at 2 in the morning. The voicemails were desperate, panicked, begging me not to make those messages public. She said it would destroy her relationships with her family, that her friends would never forgive her, that her coworkers would see her differently. She said she'd give me anything I wanted, that we could settle this quietly, that she'd walk away with nothing if I just keep those messages private. I listened to every voicemail and deleted them without responding. Her final message came at 3:47 a.m. on February 24th. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. She said I couldn't do this to her, that she'd be homeless without me, that I was destroying her entire life. She said she was sorry for everything, that she'd never meant for things to get this bad, that she'd take back everything she said if she could. Then she said something that told me the pressure was working. She said her parents had told her they wouldn't help her anymore if the messages became public, that they were humiliated by what she'd said about their values and their son-in-law, that she'd brought shame on the family. She said Warren had stopped returning her calls. She said Kylie was angry that Patricia had dragged her into this by complaining about me to her for months. Patricia was discovering what I'd learned at Christmas. That respect mattered more than anything, and once you lost it, everything else crumbled. But I wasn't done yet. Final update. Patricia showed up at my studio apartment on February 26th. I don't know how she got my address, probably from someone at the business, or maybe she'd followed me at some point. I was working from home that Thursday when someone knocked on my door around 2 in the afternoon. I looked through the peephole and there she was, looking like she hadn't slept in days. I opened the door but didn't let her in. She asked if we could talk. I told her we could talk through our attorneys. She said she needed to talk to me directly, that this had gone too far, that we needed to figure this out like adults. I asked her what part of serving her with divorce papers made her think I wanted to have adult conversations with her. She started crying right there in my doorway. She said she knew she'd made mistakes, that she'd said terrible things, that she'd hurt me. But she said making those Instagram messages public would destroy her entire life, that it would humiliate her in front of everyone she knew, that it wasn't fair punishment for what she'd done. I told her that publicly humiliating me at Christmas dinner in front of her entire family wasn't fair either, but she'd done it anyway. Patricia said that was different, that it had been a private family gathering, that only 20 people had heard it. I told her those 20 people included everyone who mattered to her, and now they'd get to see exactly what kind of person she was behind closed doors. She said I was being vindictive. I said I was being honest. There's a difference. Then she tried a different approach. She said we could still work this out, that divorce didn't have to be our only option, that maybe we'd both said and done things we regretted. I asked her what specifically she regretted. She said she regretted the way things had escalated, the way we'd both hurt each other. I asked her if she regretted telling her friends and family that I was an embarrassment. She said she regretted that I'd found out about those conversations, not that she'd had them. that I'd found out. I started to close the door. Patricia put her hand on it and asked me what it would take to make this go away. I asked her what she meant. She said, what would it take for me to keep those messages private, to agree to a quick settlement, to let her move on with her dignity intact? I told her I'd already filed my settlement terms with the court. She said she couldn't afford what I was asking for, that she didn't have $68,000, that demanding repayment for household expenses was insane. I told her that was exactly how much more I'd contributed to our household than she had, that I had bank statements proving every dollar, and that if she'd been planning to divorce me anyway, she should have been saving money instead of spending it on weekend trips and restaurant meals. She said I was twisting everything, that married couples didn't keep score like that. I told her she'd kept score of every way I'd failed to meet her expectations for 3 years, so I figured I was just playing by her rules. Patricia asked me what I wanted from her. I told her I wanted exactly what she'd wanted when she was researching divorce with her brother. I wanted out of the marriage with my assets protected, and I wanted her to face consequences for how she'd treated me. She said I was trying to destroy her financially. I said she'd tried to destroy me socially and emotionally, and I was just better at follow-through. She stood there in my doorway for another minute, trying different angles. She said her parents wouldn't help her anymore. She said Warren was furious at her for putting the family in this position. She said Kylie had told her she'd brought this on herself. She said her friends were asking questions about the divorce and she didn't know what to tell them. She said her coworkers had seen the process server and rumors were spreading at her office. I asked her how it felt to have everyone she knew questioning her character. She said it felt awful, that she didn't deserve this. I told her she'd spent 18 months telling those same people that I was a failure and an embarrassment, and she'd never stopped to think about how that felt for me. She said that was private venting, not the same thing at all. I said making her private thoughts public was the only way to show people who she really was. Then Patricia said something that showed me she still didn't get it. She said that if I went through with this, if I made those messages public and demanded all that money, she'd have to move back in with her parents. She said she was 31 years old and moving back home because of a divorce would be humiliating. She said I was taking everything from her marriage, her independence, her dignity. I told her she'd taken my dignity when she called me dead weight in front of her family. She said that was one comment made in anger. I said it was the truth she'd been hiding for years finally coming out, and that everything since then had just been her trying to manage the fallout. She asked me if I'd always been this cold. I told her I'd learned from the best. Patricia left after that. She sent me one more text that night saying her attorney had advised her to accept a settlement to avoid the messages becoming public. She said she'd agree to waive any claim to the business, assume full responsibility for the apartment lease, and pay me back the difference in household contributions in monthly installments over 2 years. In exchange, I'd agree to keep the Instagram messages sealed and confidential. I showed Sarah the offer. She said it was better than we'd get in court, that Patricia was essentially giving me everything I'd asked for, but she also said that if I rejected it and pushed for full public disclosure, Patricia would fight harder and the whole thing would drag on for months. She asked me what I wanted more: quick resolution with financial victory or prolonged battle with public humiliation. I thought about that. I thought about Patricia sitting in her sister's house, probably crying, probably wondering how her life had fallen apart so fast. I thought about her parents being disappointed in her. I thought about Warren avoiding her calls. I thought about her having to explain to everyone at her office why she was moving back home at 31. Then I thought about standing in her parents' house on Christmas, listening to her call me dead weight while her cousins laughed. I thought about reading those Instagram messages and realizing she'd been planning to leave me while pretending everything was fine. I thought about 3 years of subtle digs and dismissive comments and being treated like I was an embarrassment to her very existence. I told Sarah to reject the offer. I told her to file a counteroffer. Patricia pays back the $68,000 in full within 6 months, assumes the apartment lease with no penalty to me, waives all claims to the business, and the Instagram messages become part of the public record as evidence of premeditated divorce planning and emotional abandonment. Take it or take it to trial. Sarah asked me if I was sure. I told her I'd never been more sure of anything. Patricia's attorney called Sarah 2 days later. They'd amended their offer. Patricia would pay back $50,000 in a lump sum by April 15th, assume the lease, waive business claims, and the messages would remain sealed pending completion of payment. If she defaulted on payment, the messages would be released automatically. I told Sarah to take it, not because I was being generous, but because it was smarter. Patricia would have to drain her savings, probably borrow money from family despite their disappointment, and live with the constant threat of exposure hanging over her if she missed a payment. It was better revenge than just humiliating her once. The settlement was finalized on March 8th. Patricia had to sign paperwork acknowledging the debt, the payment terms, and the consequences of default. Sarah said Patricia looked sick during the signing, that her attorney had advised her not to agree to these terms, that the payment amount was excessive for what would typically be considered marital debt. But Patricia signed anyway. She signed because she knew the alternative was worse. She signed because her family had cut her off emotionally, and she couldn't afford a prolonged court battle. She signed because she'd spent 3 years underestimating me, and now she was paying the price. The divorce was final on March 22nd. I got the notification from Sarah while I was at the office. David and Lucas took me out for drinks that night to celebrate. We talked about the business, about our plans for the next year, about the 3 new clients we'd signed in February. The company that Patricia had called a joke, that she'd told everyone was going nowhere, had just cleared $300,000 in projected revenue for the year. Patricia made her first payment on April 14th, $49,900 transferred to my account in one lump sum. She'd come up with most of it, which meant she'd either drained every penny of savings or borrowed heavily from family who supposedly weren't helping her anymore. The remaining $100 was due within 30 days, according to the agreement. She missed the second payment. May 15th came and went with no transfer. Sarah sent a formal notice of default on May 16th. Patricia's attorney responded within hours saying there'd been a misunderstanding about the payment schedule, that the remaining balance would be paid immediately. The final $100 hit my account on May 17th, exactly $50,000 total. Patricia had paid everything she owed me. But here's what she didn't know. The settlement agreement had a clause Sarah had buried in the financial terms section. It stated that any default, even temporary, even if corrected within 30 days, gave me the option to release the sealed evidence to the court record. Patricia's attorney had missed it, or hadn't explained it properly. I called Sarah on May 18th and told her to file the Instagram messages as supplementary evidence of the divorce circumstances. She asked me if I was sure, reminded me that Patricia had technically fulfilled the settlement terms. I told her a day late was still late, and the agreement gave me the option. Sarah filed the messages on May 20th. They became part of the public court record. Anyone searching for our divorce case could now read every conversation Patricia had with her sister, her cousin, her friends. Every message where she'd called me an embarrassment, every admission that she regretted marrying me, every conversation about divorce planning while our marriage was supposedly intact. Patricia called me from a number I didn't recognize on May 21st. I answered because I wanted to hear this. She was screaming, crying, saying I'd promised to keep those messages sealed if she paid. I told her to read the settlement agreement again, specifically the default clause. She said that wasn't fair, that she'd paid everything. I said she'd paid it late, and late meant default. And default meant I had the option to release the evidence. She called me every name she could think of. She said I'd tricked her, that I was vindictive and cruel, that I'd manipulated the entire settlement to make sure she got hurt no matter what. I told her she'd manipulated me for 3 years by pretending to support my business while telling everyone it was a joke. I told her she'd called me dead weight at Christmas and now she knew exactly what carrying actual weight felt like. Patricia said her parents had stopped speaking to her completely after the messages became public. She said Warren had told her she'd embarrassed the entire family. She said Kylie had said she couldn't believe how fake Patricia had been about her marriage. She said her friends had been asking her why she'd stayed married to me if she felt that way, and she didn't have a good answer. I asked her if she'd found a new place to live yet. She said she'd had to move back in with her parents despite them being furious at her, that she couldn't afford anything else after paying me $50,000. She said she was 31 years old sleeping in her childhood bedroom because I destroyed her financially. I told her she'd destroyed herself by thinking she could trash me for years without consequences. Then, I hung up and blocked her number. The last I heard about Patricia was from Mark and Jennifer, the couple who'd known us both since college. They ran into her at a shopping center in early June. Jennifer told me Patricia looked tired and bitter. She'd apparently been complaining about the divorce, about how I'd been vindictive, about how the settlement had been unfair. Mark had asked her why she'd stayed married to me if she felt the way those Instagram messages showed. Patricia hadn't had a good answer for that either. Jennifer said some of their mutual friends had stopped talking to Patricia after the messages became public. People who'd heard Patricia's complaints about me for years were now questioning whether anything she'd said was true. People were wondering why she'd married me in the first place if she'd had so many doubts. People were asking why she hadn't just left instead of staging a public humiliation at Christmas. Patricia had wanted everyone to see me as a failure. Instead, everyone saw her as someone who'd stayed in a marriage she didn't believe in while lying to everyone about it. The contempt she'd shown me at Christmas had been real, but so had the years of pretending before that, and people couldn't figure out which version of Patricia was genuine. The business is doing well. We hired 2 more people in April. We signed a contract with a client that would bring in more revenue than our first 2 years combined. David and Lucas and I are talking about expanding into 2 new markets by the end of the year. The company Patricia called my little startup, my joke of a career, my embarrassing hobby, is on track to clear $500,000 in revenue this year. I'm not dating anyone. I'm not interested in relationships right now. I'm focused on building something that matters, on proving that taking risks and following through on your vision is worth more than playing it safe to please people who don't believe in you anyway. Sometimes I think about Patricia living in her childhood bedroom, paying off debts, explaining to people why her marriage ended. Sometimes I think about her parents being disappointed in her, about Warren avoiding her calls, about Kylie being angry at her. Sometimes I think about all the friends who've stopped talking to her because they saw who she really was behind the supportive wife act. And I don't feel bad about any of it. She spent 3 years treating me like I was beneath her. She called me dead weight at a family dinner. She planned to divorce me while pretending our marriage was fine. She tried to claim half of a business she'd spent years calling a failure. She did all of that because she thought I was weak, thought I'd just accept being treated with contempt, thought she could control the narrative and walk away clean. She was wrong about all of it. And now she's living with the consequences of underestimating someone she'd decided was a loser. I walked out of that Christmas dinner at 9:47 p.m. knowing my marriage was over. What I didn't know was that I'd spend the next 5 months systematically dismantling everything Patricia had built her identity around. Her financial independence, her social standing, her family's respect, her carefully crafted image as the successful one in our marriage. You kill someone's dignity in public, you better be ready for them to return the favor. And I was ready.